give us her talk.
All right. Thank you, Lynn. Did you?
Welcome. Appreciate you doing it.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Did you want me to do my bio, Johnny?
Yeah, I can do that for you.
Oh,
Okay.
Thank you.
We're very fortunate to have Nikki with us today. She has Darlington roots and has visited South Carolina many times for conferences and for research. She discovered she is a descendant of David Kelly and Elizabeth Tyner Kelly, who are buried in McLean Cemetery in Darlington County, just off of Old Camden Road. She has ancestry in Bishopville and Lee County through the Barrett family, many of whom are buried in Piedmont Cemetery. Nikki is an IT project manager with Health Resource Services Agency, a sub-agency of Health and Human Services based in Rockville, Maryland. In 2020, Nikki was awarded the Board of Certified Genealogists' first Paul Slubby Scholarship to become a certified genealogist, which she plans to complete early next year. So that's quite an honor there. Nikki is originally from St. Louis, Missouri, and currently lives in Atlanta with her husband, Viju, their 3 cats, and 1 dog. And she is a great researcher, I'll tell you that right now.
Thank you. And my cat, I put her outside and she has just started to meow outside my door. So we're going to have to ignore her. And let me get my slides up here. Can everyone see my slides?
Yep.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right. Great. Well, thank you all again. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Donnie and Renee and everybody for inviting me. And again, thank you for coming today on football Sunday and whatever Sunday. And I appreciate y'all coming here to hear my story that I love to share, this amazing story that I just stumbled in my lap that I always keep saying. So I can't take credit for it. It's just something that showed up. But I'm going to talk today about how I was able to find more about my family through horse racing records, through horse racing and literature, how I was able to find that out. So let's get started. And actually, for background, I have an ancestor named Hark. He was referred to as Old Hark, all types of different nicknames, but he traveled across the country. He was hired out. He was from Virginia, and his owner hired him out across the country, and including South Carolina. So today's topic is I'm going to talk about his time that I know about in South Carolina with different racing stables in South Carolina. And some background to horse racing in the United States. Horse racing, according to many historians, I'll start my timer. Many historians have decided to categorize American horse racing into 4 distinct time periods. And the time period that I'm going to talk about today, which includes South Carolina, will be the first period that John Hervey is the historian that I'm referring to. And John Hervey was just chronicled horse racing in the United States. And he's considered, his works, Racing in America, has several volumes, and it's essentially considered the Bible for horse racing history in the United States. So his first category is 1665 to 1865, of course, and that's up to the Civil War.
Where's it coming from?
His first period, and then there are a total of 4, ending in 1979. But the first period, up to 1865, I think everyone's not on mute. I don't know who that gentleman is. If everyone could go on mute, I would appreciate it. Thank you. So up to 1865 was for the first period, and that included such famous horses as Boston and his father, Sir Archie, and then Sir Archie's grandson, Lexington. And essentially, a lot of the horses that are racing alive today, thoroughbreds, today are descendants of these horses, these 3 that I have listed there. And John Hervey goes on to, he has 1922 to 1936, sort of the Depression area for a category. And then he had World War II, pre and post World War II was another 3rd category that the Jockey Club of New York who published that Racing in America volumes. They have World War II, a War Admiral citation, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with these horses, and there were certainly movies about a lot of these horses. And the final period, according to Racing in America, that series is 1960-1979, where the dominant horse was Secretariat. But for today's purpose, I'm going to talk about up to 1865 again, and then I want to spend a little bit about the time period that was ignored by Hervey and other racing historians. And again, they had these 4 categories, but 1865 through 1922 was ignored in those volumes. And I was curious about that because that was a very transformative time in American history, as we all know, and in horse racing history. And as far as the sport itself, during that time period, it transitioned from places like South Carolina, from Louisiana, from Mississippi. It transitioned from the South to the North. And it was a shift from the plantation-based system, which was how racing in the South was basically organized, run by slaves, all the way from the breeding of the horses, the birthing of the horses, the tending of the colts, and management, grooming, all of that was handled primarily by slaves. But it also included free blacks as well, who did very well in the sport. And then it also, white men also were trainers and worked in the sport as well. But it is very difficult to compete against slave labor as a trainer, as a horse trainer, but it did happen. And there were white trainers and black trainers, and they were mentioned together in racing journals that I'll cover on the next slide. But just again, back to the time frame, I want to emphasize that in 1865 up to this time, horse racing was based on endurance. And horse races were events, they were social events of the year, and they lasted all day. Horses ran multiple times around a track, and it's nothing like it is today, where horses at the Kentucky Derby, they run one time around the track and how fast they can get there, and that's the end of the race, everyone go home. That is not the culture that it was in the South, and especially not in South Carolina. And at that time, the emphasis was on endurance, as opposed to what it is now. It's based on speed. So that's a little background about horse racing. And as far as journals, a lot of the information that I was able to find was the Spirit of the Times was a premier racing sports journal in the 19th century. And another one was the American Turf Register of the 19th century. And I don't know if you all can see that. I don't know if I'm hiding that. Am I hiding that? Okay, hopefully that's out of the way. So these are the journals, American Turf Register and Spirit of the Times. And if you think you may have had ancestors who were in racing, or they were at some big race, or they were owners, they were trainers, they did anything, you would want to check these publications at that time period to see if they're listed there, because all races were covered in these magazines, in these journals, essentially. But the Spirit of the Times was published in 1831 to 1861, up to the Civil War. And by 1839, it was the most popular sporting journal in the United States. And it was primarily supported by Southern plantation owners, because racing at that time in the racing was everywhere in the United States, certainly New York, New Jersey, all of the 13 colonies. But racing especially took hold in the South, because in the northern areas, the Puritan mores, this different culture was in the North, and the culture did not necessarily support gambling and racing and the activities that are generally associated with horse racing. But in the South was different, and the South took root to horse racing, and it thrived there. And essentially, primarily, not only that, and there was a lot of money that as it is today. It took a lot of money to put on horse racing, and there was a lot of money. The money was essentially focused in the South at that time. South Carolina, certainly Charleston, as we're aware, and places like Natchez, Mississippi, had the highest concentration of millionaires at one time in the 1850s. So racing just was more popular in the South. There were conditions, the grass that was needed for horses, and then there was slave labor that was needed to help maintain such an expensive sport, primarily. But the difference again between these two journals, the Turf Register stopped publication in about 1844 and 1861 for the spirit of the times, but they are archived and they are in all kinds of libraries, and they were weeklies. So there's a lot of volumes that were generated during that time period. And in addition to those journals, I also found information in family papers. And if when you research family papers, you have to remember that they are categorized by topic. And a lot of family papers are organized by headings, and some of the headings are racing and horse racing. So even if you don't have a family in mind, you could, if you're looking for a particular area, you can go to that archive. Like I went to the South Carolina Library, and they had papers organized by horse racing. So that's another way, if that's an area that you want to look to, you can look to see which archives have family papers organized by that heading, by horse racing, horse breeding, horse whatever. And then of course, newspapers is what I use as well to kind of just flesh out this story. And newspapers certainly carried horse racing, big events, sporting events as well, but again, these two journals were devoted to sports exclusively, so in the 19th century. Next, let's see. Now let's get to the good stuff. Let's get to Charleston in South Carolina. Charleston Race Week. Has anyone heard of Charleston Race Week? Are we familiar with that? Is anyone familiar with that? I can probably see some faces. That's not much. We are familiar with that. Wow. Well, Charleston Race Week, and I cannot reiterate this enough, was the biggest event in South Carolina, the biggest social event every year in South Carolina for decades, from about the 1820s up to 1878, as it says, as I have here. South Carolina, as far as racing history in South Carolina had the oldest jockey club. The first is to establish a jockey club in 1792. And that's, certainly just after the American Revolution, when the country, essentially just after the country ratified the Constitution. But Charleston, South Carolina was the first to have a jockey club established. And it was disbanded in 1899. The way that the race week was organized was 4 days. It started the first Wednesday in February. And the day one was the annual dinner. And Friday, there were balls, and there were just, again, I cannot stress enough that this was the social event, perhaps of the South during that week. Nothing else happened in the country other than race week in South Carolina. But there were races every day. The first day there were 4-mile heats, and a heat is just a race, and they're 4 mile meaning around the track 4 times, because racing tracks were 1 mile, and how many times the horses ran around that determined the endurance. And as I mentioned earlier, horses were bred to do this, not only run 4 miles 4 times around a track, but they did that 3 times a day. And that's totally different, again, what we have now, just Kentucky Derby, horses get across the finish line without hopefully breaking their leg. But during that time frame, horses were bred. And again, because for endurance, horses had to last all day, because this was a social event that lasted all week. So they ran all day, 3 times a day, and then they would perhaps do that again, if not the next day, the day after next, but they were expected to run throughout the week. So it was just make the horses last as much as possible, and that's how they were trained for this. So again, Thursday, 3-mile heats, Friday, 2 miles, and then day 4, Saturday, more racing as well. And there were shops, stands, restaurants were open that week. There were real estate auctions. There were you can buy your horses, you can buy a plantation that week. And certainly that would have been a big week for slave sales, slave auctions as well. And we have to understand that in gambling, slaves could be wagered on the racetrack, and plantations were commonly lost during races. So if you could gamble your plantation, and then all the slaves or half the slaves, or whatever that goes with that. So I just wanted to reiterate that with the balls and the debuts, because this race week was integrated heavily in South Carolina, the social community, and engagements were had at race week. Weddings were planned around it. Again, the balls, ladies were presented and debuted, every year. So I cannot reiterate enough how popular this event was and critical to South Carolina, elite South Carolina society. Now, certainly the racetracks were open to everyone, stands, anyone could buy a ticket, gamble, throw your money away at the races, but these events, the balls, the debuts, of course, were strictly limited to the very top of South Carolina society. So I wanted to mention that, and then have the flip side that, that was entirely run by slaves. The tracks, the horses were managed by slaves. Certainly the cooking, I would assume, the seamstresses, any activities that were required to put on such productions would have been primarily organized by slave labor. But nonetheless, these events were attended by presidents, governors every year. One honorary member of the Jockey Club was Richard Singleton, who I'll mention a bit. And Richard Singleton and men like Wade Hampton, the Hampton family, and the Sinclair, William Henry Sinclair family. These were some of the prominent families that helped support and continue the South Carolina Jockey Club. And Richard Singleton, for example, was an honorary member for 50 years of the South Carolina Jockey Club. So one of the members I mentioned, Wade Hampton, and can you, is it hiding? Am I hiding the slides? Let me move it over here. I'll let you see those pictures. But Wade Hampton, as I mentioned, was a prominent racing family, from a prominent racing family in South Carolina. And the way I found out about Wade Hampton, or how my research kind of intersected with Wade Hampton, is that his horses were imported by a man from Virginia. Dr. Alexander Merritt was a horse importer from Virginia, Greensville County, Virginia. And he imported horses, certainly not just for Wade Hampton. He would have imported for Singleton, and in North Carolina, and Louisiana, and Mississippi. He was a physician, a local politician, a horse importer. He did all kinds of things. And one of, some of the horses that he did import were for Wade Hampton. And then in addition to that, Merritt would import horses, and then he would also offer services. Like, well, I sold you this horse, but then if you need help training, I have trainers available for you. And one of the trainers that he offered that was hired out for Wade Hampton was my ancestor, Hark. So that's how my ancestor kind of was integrated or associated with the Hampton family, because he trained horses that were imported by his slave owner, Dr. Merritt of Virginia. So some of the horses that Hampton had produced other horses that won championships. One horse, for example, Prioress, who was in Louisiana, Prioress became the first American-bred, American-raised horse to win a race in England, at Newmarket in England. And that was a horse that was trained by Hark in Louisiana, but that horse, the genealogy of that horse was integrated with Wade Hampton, with the Wade Hampton family. And how I found out about his name, because I saw newspaper ads, and newspaper ads said, well, I'm offering Hark for hire, and you can refer to Wade Hampton and Richard Singleton. And you can refer to these gentlemen for Hark's, beautiful qualities. These men will vouch for that. So that's how, when I saw that, I had no idea who these men were, of course. but you know, as I had more research, I learned more about who they were, and you know how extensive they were in the horse racing industry. Richard Singleton, also, as I mentioned, the 50-year honorary member of the South Carolina Jockey Club. He also hired Hark as well for a time in the 1840s, but Hark was not Richard Singleton's primary trainer. Singleton's primary trainer was a man named Cornelius, who was a very famous Black trainer in his own right in the area. But of course, you know, they would try out different trainers, have a different horse, you want to try something different, and that's perhaps what he was doing when he wrote to Merritt. And Singleton also, I saw letters at the South Carolina Library where Singleton and Merritt were negotiating terms of hire. They were negotiating prices, and Merritt had wrote in letters that he forbid Singleton from sending Hark to the Low Country due to malaria. And another part I found interesting was that they were discussing Hark's clothing. And Merritt said in the letter, well, you know, he was gone and I know you wanted to hire him and I want to get him there as soon as possible to you. But I didn't get his clothes ready because he was coming from another job and I wanted to send him, you know, to you as soon as possible. So if you wouldn't mind, could you get some clothes, and then you get his clothes and I'll, you know, take that out of his wages. So just the minutia of things that are discussed in the letters, I was able to see that between Merritt and Singleton. And again, as I mentioned, Merritt's ads that he had in the newspaper, in the racing journals for Hark's services, he mentioned, oh, Singleton will vouch for Hark, you know, along with Hampton. And so, and just to summarize, these stables run by, you know, these large, massive stables relied on the expertise and the free labor of slaves in the raising, the training, and the riding, and the breeding of these thoroughbreds. And another South Carolina racing family that I also want to include are the Sinklers, William Sinclair, and they were out of Berkeley County in South Carolina. And I'm mentioning Sinclair because he also had a trainer, not a horse, a trainer referred to as Old Hark. So as I was searching, I ran into two of those, and I was wondering if this was my Hark, and I was wondering how he was in so many different places in newspapers at the same time. But I found out through research that this was a different Old Hark, because that's what my Hark was referred to. He was referred to as Old Hark. I saw him as Fat Hark. I saw him as Harkness. There's just all types of different names, but I just wanted to make sure this wasn't the same one. But this particular Hark was in 1862 in Charleston. There was a famous race in Charleston with Albine versus Planet, and one of the trainers was Old Hark. But my Hark was in Louisiana at that time, and this Hark, the South Carolina papers had mentioned he had passed away, and he was lamented and greatly missed in the papers. So again, I want to stress that my ancestor was certainly not the only trainer. There were other trainers, Black trainers all across the country, and he was just one of many trainers that we have. But fortunately, we were able to find more about him, and that is one of my goals, to also document the stories of other trainers like Hark as well. But the Sinclair family had a Hark, and that was not my Hark, so I wanted to bring that up, include that family as well. Who was Hark, my ancestor, who was in South Carolina? He, again, was not Hercules, and Sinclair's Hark I saw was also referred to Hercules, and apparently Hark is a nickname for Hercules, but I've never seen my ancestor referred to Hercules. And my ancestor was not dead in 1865 like this one was, because I saw him later. But he was, as I mentioned, enslaved by Dr. Merritt of Virginia. And if we know the history, soil depletion in Virginia, and slavery kind of had to change because the land could not sustain massive amounts of slaves. So slaves were hired out from Virginia, like my ancestor was. And Dr. Merritt hired him not only to South Carolina, but to Louisiana, North Carolina, and Mississippi as well, all over the place. But with the information that I do have, I know for certain he was a celebrity in his field, and he had a family, he was married, he had sons, and he had grandchildren. And he was my fourth great grandfather that I found this information about. And here is a picture that I found just throughout my research. I don't think he's fat in that, but I don't know what the definition of fat was, or at that time. But this is a picture of one of his horses in 1854 that I found in Louisiana. And I found out that was him because the picture said he had his hands behind his back, and then it mentioned the white spot on the horse and his name, and the circumstances around the picture. So I'm happy to find that and share that with everyone. But as far as South Carolina, back to racing in South Carolina and what happened with racing in South Carolina, the factors that led to the decline is that, as I mentioned earlier, the soil depletion of cotton, tobacco in Virginia, and those types of crops, one type of crop destroys the soil. And people left Virginia, they left South Carolina, North Carolina, and they made their way to richer soils in the Mississippi Delta, for example, and then the Alabama Black Belt, where the soil was literally black. It was so rich with nutrients. And certainly horse racing would follow the population, because again, in order for horse racing to be successful, it needs to be where people can gamble and place bets and have gate receipts, so that if people are leaving, then so the horse race is going to follow where the people are. So, and that's why New Orleans eventually eclipsed Charleston as the epicenter of racing in the United States. From the 1850s, 1860s, New Orleans, Louisiana was the #1 location, the center of horse racing in the antebellum. In antebellum America, New Orleans became the #1 center. And I have pictures here, and you can see at the top that is in South Carolina, a depiction of the Washington course in South Carolina. And as you can see, it's a lot smaller than New Orleans. You see the one at the bottom, that's New Orleans, that's the Metairie course in New Orleans. And it's got 2 levels, and it's double, perhaps even triple the size, bigger racetrack, more people. So that's what I mean when I say that New Orleans eventually would eclipse Charleston as far as sporting history, as far as racing history. Everything was bigger and better. And once it got to New Orleans. And another factor about what happened to racing in South Carolina is that Richard Singleton's exit from racing. He was in, very a dominant figure in racing, but he eventually got out of the business. He stopped racing, sold his horses, stables, and he did not participate in the sport anymore. And that was about the late 1840s, early 1850s, I'm not sure exactly, but by 1852, he was killed in a train wreck with his grandson. Apparently there was a lot of rain that washed out some of the track, and he was killed. And that was certainly a blow to racing in South Carolina. Certainly wasn't the death knell. Racing still happened, as I mentioned, in 1862. But Singleton was a major benefactor of the racing scene in South Carolina, and his departure eventually would have long-term effects on that as far as sustaining it and keeping it going. And then by the war also, of course, eventually did take its toll on racing in South Carolina. That race that I mentioned with the other heart for the Sinklers, that race was in 1861. And then there was another race in 1862. So racing continued even though the war started in 1861. Racing was important. Of course, as we all know, during the war, people didn't think it was that serious or it was going to last. It was going to be over in a week. So racing continued. But eventually, by the end of the war, of course, racing was killed by the Civil War in the South, in South Carolina, in all the states, Louisiana as well. The Confederate government had used Washington course as a prisoner of war camp for Union soldiers, and there about over 260, I think it was 264 I think was a number were died primarily of disease at the prisoner of war camp. And they were hastily buried in shallow graves, of course, by slave workers at the course. But one, I don't know if this is trivia or history, I would say history, not trivia, but it has been noted that on that course is where Memorial Day started, at the Washington course in South Carolina, because on May 1st, 1865, was recorded as the earliest Memorial Day commemoration on record. And that was when freedmen returned back to the Washington course to pay homage to the Union dead. And there were parades, from what I read, everyone was dressed in white, there were parades, flowers, songs, prayers. And so Washington course, that I certainly didn't know this, I don't know if a lot of people know that, is where Memorial Day traditions first started in the United States. And another piece of trivia about South Carolina racing is that in New York, as we know, racing now is headquartered in New York at Belmont Park, Saratoga, New York, in that area. But there, in the gates at Belmont Park, there are the clubhouse entrance at Belmont has 4 stone pillars. And those stone pillars were part of the gates at Washington course in South Carolina. And Augustus Belmont, who eventually was responsible for the migration of horse racing to be centered in New York, Augustus Belmont offered to purchase these stone pillars from the gates from the Washington course, but the city of Charleston decided instead to give it as a gift to New York, to usher in a new era and pass the torch, if you will, these stone pillars. That it was acknowledgement that South Carolina, that we were moving racing to the north, and here are the gates, and to continue the tradition. So a little bit of history about that. If you're ever in New York and you go to the gate, you will know those are from South Carolina. And as far as the epilogue about Hark, my ancestor, he eventually left South Carolina and he went on to Louisiana and set racing records there and continued on. But the Civil War, as I mentioned, did take its toll in Louisiana as well. And especially one thing to mention, a law during the Civil War was the Confiscation Act of 1862. And it's really important to note that when the war started, the number one thing I would think, the number one target when the war started were racing stables. When men were going off to war and going into battle, they need horses, and the generals needed high quality, well-bred horses. And again, because these horses were built for endurance and stamina, they could travel long distances, keep going in battle, these horses were prized. So these same horses that I had mentioned, traveling 4 mile heats, going around a track 4 miles 3 times a day, these were valuable horses to be used on the battlefield. So these racing stables, Hamptons in Louisiana, they were targets. And in Louisiana, for example, Hark, the man that Hark was working for, Wells, he fled to Texas. He took his horses and fled to Texas to escape both Confederate cavalry units and also Union. I mean, they were both Southerners and Northerners were after these horses. So this kind of explains the collapse, because the racing, of course, did collapse in the South. And one of the reasons why is because a lot of the prized horses were taken for battle. And if they weren't killed in battle, they were injured, and they just were not available anymore for racing. And racing just wasn't necessary when people are killing each other by the hundreds of thousands. You don't need a horse race, you need horses to help survive that. The generals like Wade Hampton III, I mentioned him because he was a general. His father, that's who I mentioned earlier, but Wade Hampton III was one of the generals who, is in the war with prized thoroughbred horses. And not just the generals, the cavalry officers wanted horses also. And then you have in 1863, there was an event called Morgan's Raid. And In Kentucky, horses were raided in Kentucky and Tennessee, all over the place. They just travel across state lines looking for horses. I mean, just to steal, not to buy them, they were just looking because they had guns and men, and that's what they wanted for horses. And as far as how I know about that is because Hark sent, and in Louisiana, horses were sent to Kentucky to breed. And there was a breeding farm, the man's name was Grinstead. James Grinstead, he had a very prominent breeding farm in Kentucky. And his farm was a target for the Morgan's raid, and a lot of horses were taken or killed. The ones that weren't stolen were killed. So in Louisiana, again, as I mentioned, Hark, his owner, where he was, he fled to Texas. So that's really what happens to the prize horses. And any horses that were not killed or stolen, they ended up on the auction block for pennies on the dollar and sent to northern racetracks. And it was advertised, and people came from all over the country when they heard these horses were going up for sale. One interesting note that I found out that, of course, because horse racing was destroyed and the turfs were destroyed, that doesn't mean interest in horse racing was diminishing anyway. So it still did continue, but it just transitioned, as I mentioned, from north to south. And one interesting thing, the most famous horse of the 19th century, Lexington, he was the most dominant horse and most prolific horse of the entire 19th century. And his skeleton is kept in the Smithsonian Museum. To this day, you can see a skeleton in the museum. But he was not caught up in the confiscations. He was not stolen. He was not killed during the war because he was secretly taken to Illinois for safekeeping during the war. And Hark, my ancestor, was also in Illinois. I don't know I have no documentation to prove he, Hark, and this horse Lexington were in Illinois at the same time. But he did end up there. And I think perhaps he would have been one of the only few men in the country who would have been trusted enough to keep this expensive, valuable horse safe during the war. Because I have a hard time finding his whereabouts during the Civil War, but then when I found out Lexington was in Illinois, and then I saw Hark was in Illinois in 1865, 7, so I just think it's too much of a coincidence. Again, I don't have any proof of that, but I think my ancestor had something to do with helping this horse escape death, during the most famous horse in America escape death during the Civil War. But in these pictures that I have here, this is Sherman's headquarters in Beaufort, South Carolina. And this picture here is of the Washington course with graves of Union soldiers buried there. So that's why it really could never again be revived as a racing venue. And then the South Carolina Racing Club was not the only one. There was the Camden Racing Club, as I have here, and there was a jockey club in Columbia as well. And of course, those were all disbanded with the advent of the Civil War. And one final note on South Carolina, the Jockey Club, as I mentioned, disbanded in 1899, but they did give their relics, their artifacts to the Charleston Library. So there's information there about. But there were several attempts to revive racing in South Carolina. And even if I Googled the term race week in Charleston, and now it is used by a regala, a boating organization. So nowadays, Race Week in South Carolina has to do with boat racing. So people over time have tried to revive racing or use the name, but Charleston Race Week was a very important social event for the state. And again, Race Week, as I said, was the equivalent of the South Carolina State Fair. That's how important it was every year. So again, to recap, horse racing was America's first mass spectator sport, and you can find information if your ancestor was a turfman. Racing periodicals and archive family papers will have information, and it will help you pin down your ancestors' associates and their activities and their whereabouts. So I wish you all the best. And if you have a turf ancestor and finding, and let me know. I'll be happy to share stories. So thank you, everyone. Again, thank you for attending. I'm going to stop sharing now. So thank you. That's
Nikki.
all I have for right now.
Thank
Nikki,
you.
is there a Hall of Fame? And if so, are very many ex-slaves or people before the antebellum or during the antebellum period inducted?
Yes, there is the authority now is the New York Racing Hall of Fame and Saratoga, New York. And no, HARC is not included in that. And I did reach out to them about that. And I didn't like his response because generally they're concerned with more modern. And if you remember on those slides that I had, how there was the gray period from 1865 to 1922, that's kind of how the racing club, that's how they have it organized. So anything that happened during that time or prior to 1865 is not a priority for the racing club, for the New York Racing Hall of Fame. You know, they're concerned with Seabiscuit and Domino and all these other famous horses. But when you get to the Civil War and antebellum South, they're very weak in that area. And so when I did reach out to them, you know, he was, well, you know, write me something up and I'll see. But, you know, it's really a long shot because, you know, yada, yada, yada. So I kind of was upset about that. So I'm just going to write my book and I don't need them. I'll put all the information in the book. And they can do that as they will, and this is their loss. They'll have to miss out. Because I feel I should not have to write up everything about you. If you were a racing historian, you would know about HARC. So I shouldn't have to tell you that. But anyway, there's also the Louisiana Racing Hall of Fame, and he's not there either. But again, it's, you know, more modern. But there are Black trainers from the Kentucky Derby. There are Blacks in there, the New York Racing Hall of Fame, but not from HARC's time period. They come after him. So,
Nikki, I have a question. I actually have two questions for you. First of all, if you have a 1760s inventory and on the inventory it lists a jockey, no name, where would you think you might look to see if you can find any information on that person, either the owner or the actual jockey?
Where is this?
In South Carolina.
In Darlington or
no, probably down in Granville, I think, John.
And yeah. Where did you see that? Where did you see jockey, or what? Oh. What context, or what document was it?
An inventory, did you say?
An inventory, yes.
Oh, you mean like a will? The
state inventory.
I think it's frozen.
So that would be like the property that was held by the
estate paper. Yes, in an estate paper.
The deceased property list.
And no name? Did they have a name?
No, just says jockey.
That'll be difficult without having a name.
You know, some of the South Carolina colonial newspapers are available. And they're searchable by any word.
Okay.
I think Accessible Archives has the South Carolina newspapers. That might be a place to look for some of those. I would imagine it'd be low country type racing and things.
There are quite a few bills of sale of slaves in the miscellaneous records collection, and I think Family Search now has all of them online. So you would be looking for the owner's name, and perhaps you'd pick up a sale of the man described, you know, as a jockey. That's possible.
Okay.
Yeah, he could be other places. I mean, just besides that estate paper, I would look for other supporting documentation from the same time. No age either. Just
nothing. Just says jockey. My other question is, later on, as the owners and trainers evolved after the Civil War, at least, the stables had colors and silks, or what we
Mhm.
refer to now as silks.
Right.
So in this time frame where Hark is race or it's training, did the owners have that as a
Yes.
designation? Yes, okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yes, they
Okay.
did. Every stable had colors, and every horse and every jockey dressed under the owner's stables. That was
Okay.
very important because, you know, if you're the owner and you're putting all this money into this, you want everyone to know whose
Right.
horse that is and who, you know, especially when you win, you want every, because that's how they said they won. He won under the colors of so-and-so's stable.
Okay.
But yes, I don't know what the colors were.
Okay. Yeah, they do. They do. Okay.
Yes, that was very
Thank you.
important.
Okay.
Very, very crucial
Okay.
information.
I have a question. There's a Singleton Family Papers collection at Chapel Hill, and I think it's the Singletons from Sumter County, which I think is the same as your Singletons.
Yes.
Have you looked at those? Did you find
No.
anything there?
I have not, and that's why I am grateful for being in ProGen, the study groups, and signing up with BCG, because it helps to organize me. Because, you know, as I mentioned, Hark is in at least 6 states with different people in different counties, and I have to organize that, and I have to sit down and pin down how, you know, where he was and what he was doing, and that's just a massive undertaking. You know, and having, you know, other people have to research and then having a full-time job. And, but thank you though. I know there are Singleton, I know they're at LSU probably, I think. But I know UNC is a popular destination for Southern planter papers. So I
They're
wasn't familiar
part
with
of the series of antebellum
Antebellum.
plantation, you know, on film, some of which is now digitized. So if I
Yes.
can find you a reference, I'll stick it in the chat in a second.
Please, thank you. And I'm, you know, researching the Merritt family. These people had plantations and slaves in 4 different states at least. So I'm looking at Mississippi and Louisiana and Virginia, and I just have to organize because, you know, with slave, you know, people, these type of slave owners of these caliber, this at this level, they were in order to be that wealthy, you have to be in multiple states to amass that amount of wealth. And just we have to remember that if you are researching families, enslaved or slave owners, you have to keep that in mind. You have to, you know, look all over the country for where they were, because they, you know, as I said, in Virginia, the soil would deplete. They have to go somewhere else, but they didn't necessarily give up their property. They just kind of switch gears and did something else. So, but I will, please do, if you see that. I'm familiar with UNC, but I have not organized myself enough to have a systematic plan to you know, target everything where I need to be. And there's more, you know, I know I need to find with Hark. Thank you. Any other questions?
Any other
Gail,
questions?
do you have a question? Gail Gandy has a question. I'm kidding.
No,
I'm putting you on the spot.
okay, I just really enjoyed this. Really,
Thank you.
did.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you, Gail. Thanks, everybody.
A lot of work,
I have
It
a
is.
question for
a
you.
lot of work.
I'm looking forward to the book.
Mhm.
So is Johnny. Johnny is on me for that for years now.
Nikki, you mentioned the 2 Harks, and I don't want to do anything that would compromise your certification or anything. How do you differentiate between them if they're both in South Carolina, they both have Singleton connections? What are some ways that you differentiate between your ancestor and the other gentleman by the name of Hark or Hercules?
Well, what I mentioned was that, you know, I saw that other guy was dead, and it was mentioned in the newspapers that he had died, and the horses he worked with. So that's how I was able to distinguish the 2, because, you know, I certainly knew mine was still alive after that time period. So You know,
But
just
wasn't there a time when both of them were in South Carolina at the same time?
well, I saw the other one, you know, like I said, in the 1860s, but then they said he was around, you know, for decades as well. So they should have overlapped, I would think. But I mean, I don't know. That's part of the process, you know, the systematic
Yeah.
process of, you know, analyzing everything. But the best way that I know so far is just analyzing the family, the horse name, the names of the horses they were
Right.
working with, because they would not have been working with the same horses.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
if I know the horse, I know the owners, the stables, that should help distinguish at a certain time. You know, they could be here at this time and this time they'd be at that, but I would think at a certain time, certain horse, certain location, certain plantation, that should distinguish, I would think.
Well, I do think you're pioneering a path here. You know, anybody doing genealogy through the horse pedigrees, I mean, that's something that you don't hear, or I've never heard of before you've done this. So my hat is off to you for that.
Well, thank you. It just, like I said, it's what naturally came to me because, you know, the horses that I saw him working with later, you know, they were descendants of the same horses he was working with years ago. And of course, why wouldn't he work with? He knows these horses, he knows their qualities, so he would want to keep working with the same line. And we have to. And one thing, you know, that I saw was interesting was that, you know, these slave turfmen kept these horse genealogies in their head. And they would, you know, it wasn't written down, you know, that you had the American Turf Register, and of course they did it, but they weren't always accurate. And what I found interesting is that they said these turfmen, these wealthy millionaire, billionaire, you know, plantation owners, they would rely on the word of like Hark and other trainers in their head than they would rely with the magazine. Because if, you know, if your slave said, no, that's not right, the genealogy is this, they're going to go with that, and they're not going to go with the the magazine printed here. And they're like, well, they wouldn't care if the slave trainer said this is the genealogy of the horse, his word is bond, and that's what they went with. So, but then, you know, once these men died, or, you know, horse racing changed, that information went with them. And, you know, horse racing was, you know, a thing of honor, you know, stamina, endurance, you know, because the horse winning represented the owner. But nowadays, you know, they're just run across the track and drugged up and bandaged up, and that's all that matters. But, you know, a man's name was attached to a horse when he won, a man's family, his town, his state, the community, that's, you know, was riding on this, you know, doing horse races at that time. So very interesting.
I put the reference in the chat, so it's there.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Scott. I saw it.
Could I ask a question of Brian, Andy? Brian, get off of mute for a second.
I'm off.
Do we have anything about horse racing or horse breeding in like the 1870s in the Darlington area or near Camden?
We've got some references that reference Whipple. So yes, but apart from that, I'm not aware of anything.
Okay. All right.
Much before that, the Brockington Bacote papers, the documents that came out of, you know, Roseville, have lists of foals born in the 1790s and back that far. They're scattered in a few of them, but they are there. So certainly Brockington was extremely interested in fine breeding horses and so on. I don't think there's anyone described in his list of slaves as to who might have been especially involved in that process, but there are some written references.
I think Rick had a question. Did you have a question, Rick? Were you trying to?
Yeah, I did. I'm trying to remember what it was. Thanks for that, Nikki. That was very interesting. I like the connections you made, you know, between all of these different things too. I guess now, what I was wondering about, and I think it's partly what Renee was asking, I think that the Captain Whipple was involved. He was involved with breeding horses. I think they were trotters, though, and I wondered if that was. Is this just what you were seeing? Were there trotters involved, before the war and the stuff you're seeing, or were they all just, which sound like sort of cavalry horses, by the way, too, like they were being bred. There was like a parallel between this and breeding, which is why you could go and grab them all for the military in the Civil War.
Well, one thing I learned that they were all kinds of different categories for horses. Of course, thoroughbreds bring at the top. And I have it, so I want to mess up anything and look for it. But there were draft horses and plow horses, and you had a racing horse, but then you had a horse that you went on, that you hooked up to the buggy horse, and then you had the wagon horse, and then you had trotter horse, and about 10 different categories that I saw for horses.
Sure.
But I would think, these men who had these racing thoroughbred champions, they would have other horses as well. They would have a trotting horse, because you didn't use your thoroughbred to go to Sunday church. Maybe you would have another horse for that.
Sure.
So, but yes, if they had the thoroughbred, they would have certain. But you did have different horses for different uses around the plantation. If if you had a large plantation, you had a large social calendar, you had a horse for each event, every type of event. So
that's interesting. Actually, it makes sense, because the picture I have from like about 1893 or so is of Paul Whipple on his thoroughbred, but though he supposedly was raising trotters too for racing someplace else. So
your horse was your good shoes. You wore the good shoes when you went out to the wherever, but depending on the occasion, you had a horse. You had to have a proper horse for the proper occasion. So
and I do have a couple of records from the papers of him breeding out that horse, too, locally. So yeah, I'll have to look more closely as I get to that point and stuff I've been.
Very interesting. Horse racing was crazy. I mean, just imagine no regulation, just Wild West with the races and millions of people jammed into these places, and no law. You can just do whatever. And I lost my plantation today. Oh well, too bad. I guess I don't know, kill myself today. I lost everything, and it was just crazy when I read, just all over the place. It's very interesting time.
Well, thank you. That was really interesting.
My impression is that the Charleston racetrack was on the neck, right? The area above the proper town line, and that the neck was the scene of gambling and prostitution and free people who ran their own lives or tried to, and various marginal things that went on, and gambling was like among those. Is that right? Am I off base on that location and the characterization of the neck?
I don't know the specifics of the location. I did find a map of the club and the streets. And actually, I have it here. The book is sitting right here. I can see the names of the streets if I can find it right quick. But I'm not being familiar with Charleston, but I mean, it would not have been, the South Carolina Jockey Club would not have been associated with anything like that, anything untoward or anything, as I mentioned, the social aspect of it. So it wouldn't, of course, they would have made money off that, I'm sure, of betting and all that, but it would not have been associated with negative societal ills or anything like that. Even though, people gambled at the races, but, I'm sure they kept that part separate, and they kept it as a social event, and then, that other part was kept hidden, I guess, from it. But definitely being a member of the South Carolina Jockey Club, would associate only with the best people, the best of society, is what jockey clubs represent at that time. And the Jockey Club, this fancy society put on these balls and put on these debuts and put on these, you know, these dinners. So no, it would have been associated with a very positive thing, even though that we know nowadays that would have been associated with that, certainly. With the people, I guess the public attendees coming, you know, that would have probably, you know, they would have been gambling to support that whole aspect. But no, it was socially, it was a positive thing to be, you know, associated with the club. But gambling, you know, that goes back to why in the North it wasn't as entrenched as it was in the South, because of the gambling and the religious, you know, aspects of that. So you would want to have been a member of the Jockey Club. In New Orleans, for example, you know, that in order to, you know, be a member of society, you would needed to be a member of the Jockey Club. And, you know, they would vote down membership in the Jockey Club. And in New Orleans, for example, one of the guys who had, you know, was a lottery chief in Louisiana. And he, you know, donated lots of money all over town. He, you know, helped donate money to Tulane, my alma mater, but he was denied membership in the Jockey Club in New Orleans. So he got upset, and, you know, once this club failed, you know, after the war, he came in and bought it all with all his money that he had, and then he turned it into a cemetery out of spite. So that's why these are very serious things. And if you got denied membership from the Jockey Club, that was a serious offense. And you made enemies, and you know, they'll come for you later, like this guy did in Louisiana. So, and the cemetery is there today. Metairie Cemetery in Louisiana was the racetrack, but that's where the guy, and he put his grave site right in the center of the cemetery, right in the middle of the track is where he put his mausoleum.